What is the most historically significant event you witnessed in person? I sat on the roof of our house and watched St. Helens erupt less than 100 miles away. This must have been fascinating and terrifying in equal measure. What a thing to witness. It was amazing. The ash that covered everything like snow was interesting to kid me, but less so to my parents. I still have a jar of ash that my dad scooped up from our yard. I remember it vividly. Now that is an awesome thing to have from your dad. I was standing on my front porch watching the launch of the Challenger. Was riding in my parents' car to a basketball game in the next town over in North Texas when we saw a shooting star and thought that was neat. It was the Columbia. That shit shook my house and woke me up. I was on the freeway in CA in the 90s when a white Ford Bronco passed us, and then a whole lot of police cars. I was like 10. Hands down the best comment on here. Juice is loose. My girlfriend lived in Hawthorne and we ran up and stood on the 105 freeway waving to the news helicopters when the Bronco went by. The tumbling of the wall in Germany, along with people selling bits and pieces of it on tables in lobby in front of commissary and PX in the following weeks and months. I had picked up a chunk about the size of an Oreo and kept it, has blue spray paint on the flat side. Wonder if anyone is buying them now? My uncle was in East Berlin when the Berlin Wall fell. He was driving back to West Berlin. Normally if you drove on the road that connected the two sectors you were not allowed to stop your car on that road under any circumstances. Well, he saw a stopped car in front of him and immediately knew that something was up. He owns a piece of the Berlin Wall to this day. I would have to say the LA riots. I lived about 2 blocks from where it started. I was on my way home from school and saw someone throw a brick through a window. I didn't even wait. I just started running the whole way home. Very smart to go straight home. We had all been talking at school all day about the possibility that they would return a non-guilty verdict. And everyone thought something bad was going to go down if it happened. So the minute I saw that brick being thrown I knew what was going to happen. It was pretty scary. We lost power to our neighborhood for 3 days. You were a very intelligent and perceptive student. Not exactly. I was in class with the daughter of one of the pilots on September 11th when she found out that her father had died. We all knew about the attacks already, and we knew her father was a pilot, so when her mother came in with the principal we all knew why. It was without a doubt the most painful thing I've ever witnessed. I lived in the Bronx and was in middle school. I remember announcements for dismissal were going on and on from people picking up their kids. No one knew anything. Once I got home I went on the roof of my house and could see the giant black cloud of smoke in the distance. I mean giant. A side anecdote. My father was a foreman for a construction removal company and they got a contract to go clean the rubble there like a week or 2 later. My sister begged him not to do it and to switch because she was scared for him. I'm talking grabbing his leg in hysterics to stop him from going to work in the mornings. Most of his co-workers who signed up to go there are all dead now from lung disease or cancer. 1964 Good Friday earthquake, 9.2 Richter. Was a boy in Cordova, Alaska at the time. Can you tell more about this? I give tectonic geology presentations on one of the small cruise ships out of Juneau and talk about this earthquake. I even had one of the guests tell me he was in it when he was a 6-year-old boy and he said his biggest concern was explaining to his parents how all the broken stuff in the house wasn't his fault. Oh, so the earth broke everything in the house? Yeah, likely story, you are grounded for a month. There'll be a tectonic event on your ass if you don't get in that room. Boston Marathon bombing. I was there and then part of the medical team, the tents at the finish line. I've worked in the medical tents for a decade now. The year it was super hot the news came to do a piece about us and used me with a patient as their backdrop. My phone erupted as soon as they aired it. Same. My dad was running, 1/2 mile from the finish. Mom and my brother were waiting for him at the finish line, just out of range of the second bomb. I was on my way home from a school trip when my friend called and said, "You need to call your dad, the marathon was just bombed." I'm blessed that the only wounds my family got that day were mental and emotional. Thank you for your continued service and for all you did that day. I am glad you are here to share your story. The 3 Mile Island nuclear accident. I was a young newspaper reporter, 21 years old, standing outside the plant the morning of the accident when the workers evacuated. They refused to say what if anything was wrong. I was the first reporter on the scene, as I had been writing about the many previous problems at the plant. The morning started off as a local news story. By lunchtime, it was international news. There obviously were no cell phones. There was a single pay phone in front of the plant's observation center where we all had to take turns phoning in our stories. My dad had family in Harrisburg and his uncle died while this was going on. He went up for the funeral and brought back a "I survived 3 Mule Island" t-shirt. How many mules? LOL, it's funny so I'll leave it. I was working in New York City ICUs in April 2020. Would not recommend. A friend of mine was a nurse and some hospital in New York was offering her $6,000 per week. Unreal. She decided against it. Know what this also means? We've always had $6,000 per week to give nurses, we just haven't offered until now. I mean, it's for a temp contact and they were getting extra federal funding. The 1993 World Trade Center bombing. It's mostly forgotten now that the towers are gone, but it was a big deal back then. I remember riding across the Manhattan Bridge and looking towards the bay and thinking, well, it looks okay from here. I don't think many people understood how close the bombing could have brought those buildings down that day. I know an engineer who assisted in the inspection of the damage in the investigation. I was a young barely high school student when Marcos was overthrown in the Philippines. I was part of the People's Power along with my dad, mom and brothers. We didn't feel unsafe, but that night after Marcos left the Philippines we learned that the military was close to using force on the people. My dad was alarmed and was glad we're finally home safe, not sure why we went as a family, but at the time my parents felt being there was important enough. My parents are dead and I know they're probably turning in their graves when Marcos's son was recently elected as president of the Philippines. Never ever stop telling your story. We have to keep history alive cause these fuckers want nothing more than revisionist BS. Salamat for sharing. I was at the Who concert in Cincinnati where all the people were trampled dead. I was within 6 feet of the pile of people that died. My uncle was also at that concert. He never let his kids attend any concerts because of what happened that day. I was at the Halloween event in Seoul last year where a ton of people were crushed to death. I was in the alley over when it happened. I was in Paris for the Notre Dame fire and accidentally ended up on top of a statue with a tricolor flag being waved and a crowd singing Ave Maria, and it was like a scene from Les Miserables. I need to know how one accidentally ends up on top of a statue. The Paris metro can be very confusing for people not familiar with it. October 17, 1989. I watched the 880 Nimitz freeway collapse during the San Francisco earthquake. The Honda in front of me had the upper deck crush her front-end engine compartment. The mother and her daughter were shaken up but completely fine. I was driving a convertible Triumph Spitfire, which was scratched up slightly from debris. However, I walked away unscathed. Aside from the fact I pissed my pants, which I didn't notice until much later. I was at Kennedy Space Center in Florida for the Challenger explosion as a little kid. I only realized something bad happened when I saw the horrified faces of the adults around me. I was 4 years old. I used to be a machinist. While watching the launch, I was telling my buddies about some of the Challenger parts one had personally made. After we saw the explosion I replayed the making of all of my parts in my mind and felt sick. It turned out to be someone else's failure, which is still horrible, but it was easier for me to sleep knowing that I didn't cause it. My uncle's funeral. He died while rescuing others in a plane wreck in the water during the Vietnam War. His body was missing in action for over 22 years. His remains were returned and my elderly grandparents were able to finally bury him. It's been around 35 years since that moment in time and it was one of the most impactful things I have ever experienced. Where was he and what happened to him? How were they able to identify and receive him back after so many years? Sounds absolutely awful for your grandparents. I was in 7th grade and my brother was in 6th. We went to the state fair, and an employee leaned over the rails to adjust something. The ride hit it and exploded his head, all over us and several of our friends. My brother was just given a Dale Earnhardt jacket earlier that week and I had on my favorite jean jacket. Both were splattered with blood and brain matter. I never went on a fair ride after that. We never wore those jackets again. Spawned a deep dive into researching the lives of folks who work fair and carnivals, and that just made me more sad. I'm so sorry. I hope you've tried to see someone to talk about what you saw. No human, especially when viewing something horrific like that as a child, can really carry that their whole lives. I had something very traumatic happen to me as a kid and it fucking changes you. Entirely. I wonder every single day what sort of person I would be had I not had what happened to me, happen to me. Extensive therapy has helped me regain a semblance of what I once was, but I'm still only a fraction of what I was. NYPD. September 11, 2001. The worst of times. And the following months. The best I have ever witnessed about mankind. Same. I tell people I was in NYC for 9/11 and they always say, sorry that must have been horrible, and I try to explain how glad I was to see how great humanity can be. New Yorkers were all heart those days.